Hi again, everybody. Welcome back to our statistics class notes. We're now on page 116 in section 8.1. We're talking about hypothesis testing in general. We just got done talking about the null and the alternative hypotheses. So every hypothesis test will have two hypotheses. One's called the null and one's called the alternative. Now, note that the null hypothesis is always going to get the benefit of the doubt throughout the hypothesis testing procedure. In other words, we want to see if we have a lot of data that goes against the null hypothesis. Okay, so we're only going to reject the null hypothesis if the observed outcome would be extremely unusual if the null hypothesis were true. Okay, this is analogous to assuming that a defendant in a jury trial is innocent unless proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. So we always assume that the null hypothesis is the deal. That's really what's going on. But then do we have enough data that says, hey, that's not really probably what's going on? So there are basically one-sided and two-sided hypotheses. So what two-sided looks like, and by the way, all of the null hypotheses are the same because remember they all have an equal sign. So no matter if I have a two-sided or a one-sided left or a one-sided right hypotheses, with all the null hypotheses have an equal sign. So in other words, for example, if I think about the coin flipping thought experiment we just did, if I say the null, and this is the proper notation, you write H naught with a colon and then P equals P naught. So for example, if I'm flipping a coin and I think it's fair coin, then the null hypothesis would be P equals 0.5. In other words, 50% of the time it will come up heads or tails, whichever one we're testing. Okay. Now, one alternative could be that no, it's just not going to come up 50% of the time. Now, what that means is I'm assuming that 0.5 is the middle of my normal distribution, P naught. This P naught is whatever I'm assuming that the null hypothesis says P is, the population proportion. And I need to see if I have data far enough out in one of these tails that's given from a sample that's going to give me information to say we should reject that this P is really P naught and it's more likely out in one of these tails. Or I could do one-sided left, which says, again, the null says that P equals this P naught. The alternative would be that no, P is less than that value. So that means I'm just looking on the left side of my normal distribution and seeing if my statistic I get, my P hat, is somewhere way out in this tail, not close to what we thought P naught with the true population proportion was, which means that it's likely less than that value. And on the right side, it's the opposite of that. I'm assuming in my alternative hypothesis that P is greater than that value. So I'm looking for a P hat way out here somewhere to say, oh, that's enough information to reject that this is true and it's more likely greater than that. So in other words, the alternative hypothesis is stating your attempt to statistically demonstrate that P is likely not near the center of the distribution assumed by the null hypothesis, but rather in the tails as we just talked about. So for example, let's do a marketing and sales example. During the previous fiscal year, 10% of the orders placed at Firehouse Subs were done so online. So in an effort to increase this percentage, Firehouse Subs has purchased ads on Facebook and Twitter. Firehouse Subs gathers data on types of orders placed on a sample of 20 days during the current fiscal year. Now the question that they're asking at this point is, has there been a change? We're going to look for keywords like has there been a change, or down here I said other types of hypotheses that could have been posed. Has there been a decrease or has there been an increase? Those are kind of the keywords we're looking for: change, decrease, or increase. To ask if there has been a change on online orders, I'm asking for a two-sided alternative hypothesis. That is, I'm going to assume with the null hypothesis that it's still 10%. That's what my past information was. So P is equal to 0.10. Then I'm going to assume by purchasing these ads, I've changed it. It's no longer 10%. And that's why I want to see if I can try to show statistically. In other words, P is not equal to 0.10. So that's my alternative. I want to know if my data from my sample will show that I have enough information to reject the null and support the alternative. So is that a one-sided or two-sided? That's a two-sided, right? Whenever I have a not equal sign in the alternative, that's a two-sided. And I talked quickly already about what other hypotheses could have been posed. The question could have been more like, has there been a decrease in online orders? Then my alternative would have been that P is less than 0.10. And I could have also said, has there been an increase in online orders? Which my alternative would be P is greater than 0.10. So there's different types of hypotheses I could be posing and trying to statistically demonstrate.